Mr. Special Rapporteur, Excellencies, distinguished representatives of civil society, we are all gathered here in Geneva and in the virtual space to discuss the protection of human rights in the context of peaceful protests during crisis, the report of the Special Rapporteur on the rights to peaceful assembly and association, Mr. Clément Voule, and its recommendations. As you may know, the report is a direct follow-up of the 2020 resolution on the promotion and protection of human rights in the context of peaceful protests, introduced by Costa Rica and Switzerland, a resolution which was adopted by consensus. We welcome the work carried out by the Special Rapporteur and his team in the preparation of the report, in particular the broad consultations with hundreds of civil society representatives from all regions, with states, but also with law enforcement officers and the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. When we think of crisis situations, we all have in mind the COVID-19 pandemic that we are still struggling to overcome. Sadly, it is a fact that human rights violations in the context of peaceful protests were exacerbated in the context of the pandemic. In this regard, the report highlights several cases of excessive use of force, arbitrary arrests and detentions, as well as attacks on protesters during the COVID-19 crisis. But crisis situations are not limited to health issues. Peaceful protests often arise as a result or in relation to situations of armed conflict, terrorism or organized crime, environmental and natural disasters, economic crisis situations of food insecurity, and so on. Hence, what is important is that states fully respect their human rights obligations when dealing with peaceful protests, including in times of crisis. This is not to say that there can't be restrictions on human rights in such contexts. It is, however, essential that these restrictions, if they occur, be based in law, necessary, proportionate, and in accordance with states' obligations under international human rights law. Moreover, Switzerland agrees with the Special Rapporteur that peaceful protests should be seen as part of the solution to resolve crisis rather than the problem. In allowing individuals and communities to voice their views and opinions, peaceful protests constitute public forums and contribute to the good functioning of democratic societies. The resolution on peaceful protests that we're introducing during this session, together with Costa Rica, will build on the conclusions of the Special Rapporteur's report. We hope that we can count on the support from states and civil society to pass a substantive text reflective of the situation in the world. I hope this side event, bringing together voices from civil society, will provide a further opportunity to address contemporary challenges to the promotion and protection of human rights in the context of peaceful protests. And I thank you very much for your attention.
So without further ado, dear Special Rapporteur, I will give you the floor to also let us know about your report and give us a framework for the discussion.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and thank you also for all of you who are joining us today and in person, but also those who are joining online. Let me first really sincerely thank the Permanent Mission of Switzerland and Costa Rica for organizing really this event, and but also most of civil society that co-sponsor these side events, and I think you highlight names here, and I'm not sure that it is useful again that I can repeat them, but I think this help also to really ensure that the issue that we are discussing today enjoy broad support and broad also concern around the world. I won't go too much in detail in terms of the report, because I think I already have this interactive dialogue, and states and civil society were there, and we see how there is a consensus today that because of the crisis that we are facing around the world, this fundamental freedom should be normally the avenue for communities, civil society, and marginalized groups to really convene their view and their concern to the state. We are also seeing that this fundamental freedom is increasingly restricted and it's also repressed. And peaceful assembly or peaceful protest, which is one of the tools, like I mentioned, used by this community, is now today seen in most of the country as a threat. Because it's seen as a threat to the national security, it also, those who exercise this fundamental freedom are also labeled as enemy of the nation. This consultation, the resolution 44/20, asked my mandate to come up with how states should protect human rights in the context of peaceful protests in a crisis situation. And as you mentioned, the ambassador mentioned, COVID-19 was really one of the examples where we also all realize how these rights can be unduly restricted. And the resolution also mentioned clearly that it's important, based on the experience that we saw from the COVID-19, that this report enjoy broad consultation. And this is what I did. And I consult both regional mechanism, I consult civil society. I think those where we were not able to go in person, we were able also to organize online, and all regions were covered. But I also consult with states, and most importantly also that I give space for law enforcement to understand whether they are concerned, how peaceful protest is seen by them, and how they think that in this particular time of crisis, they can improve the management of or the policing of assembly. I will say that in general, from the whole region, what I observe or what I hear from many people is really this ongoing repression, because we are talking about the right that is still under constant repression today. So in all regions, what I hear is that these rights is increasingly repressed by the state. These rights is increasingly repressed by non-state actors, because either this right is identified as political or is identified as the right that exercised by opposition to withdraw government. And clearly in some countries also, some government mentioned to me that they are not against peaceful protests. Anti-protest is dealing with issue that doesn't touch on government accountability or anything. But what they don't like is to see protesters challenging governments. And for many of them, and strangely, it's like is challenging governments or criticizing government action is going against national sovereignty. And we heard that yesterday, which is really a big concern. And I think I asked when I was talking to the investor yesterday, I said, the council needs to clarify what is really undermining national security. Is it that we denouncing the repression on the ground, or trying to also make sure that victim voice are heard by council is undermining the national sovereignty of any country? Or do we need to agree on government restrictive law? I'm not going to mention any country here, but I was most of the time challenge and say, this is government position, and any peaceful protest should be organized within this limited and restricted framework. And if we look at this as rights, it means that some government think that these rights should be exercised as the way they want it to be. And one thing that I keep saying is that if we agree that this is fundamental freedom that is protected by the covenant, and is this right of participation. And participation means also that supporting government view, but able also to criticize government view. And if you don't accept the criticism, or if you don't accept people to be able to convene their concern, then you are not protecting the right of participation. It's not just to allow civil society to protest only when you know that you have your country is concerned about the climate change. Then you are happy when people come on the street and call the international community to support your country, but you are not happy when people talk about the corruption, when people come on the street. So these are issues that we struggle quite a lot, and question that was asking. And another thing also that I want also to emphasize here is also one of the things that when I receive when this resolution and is also for me based on the challenge and assumption that peaceful protest is a threat to the national security. Peaceful protest is a weapon on the hand of the opposition. That's what many of them tell them. That peaceful protest is seen as tools used by dissent or opponent to withdraw government. One of the things that I try to do, listen to many people, is how do we change this narrative? How do we ensure that peaceful protest is understood as tools and means? The way that the covenant see that is that it is a means for that marginalized group, minorities can use also to be able to make sure they are heard. Right? We are seeing, we from the consultation and meeting with states, those kind of argument which trying to kind of pattern peaceful protester as terrorists, as against national. How do we change this narrative to ensure that government understand the value of this fundamental freedom, that it should be protected also to advance democracy, but also to advance development? Then you can see that in this report, what I'm trying to do is also to build this new narrative on why peaceful protest is important for communities. It's important to advance human rights, to advance development. It's important also to advance the achievement of 2030 agenda. And I argue in this report also that because 2030 agenda mentioned clearly that it's important to ensure that no one is left behind, then we need also to ensure that we protect communities' ability to organize and to associate to really be the agent of the development. One of the reports highlights some of the important challenges that came out from our consultation. The first one that I'm going to really highlight is this widespread stigmatization that I just mentioned now of peaceful protest. And most of this stigmatization is always against protests that does not enjoy the government's supports. Any protest that is to promote accountability, to promote to ensure the end of inequality, or to raise concern around stigmatization of community left behind is always seen that undermine the national security. So the stigmatization is one, and even some of law enforcement mentioned to me that whenever the attitude of governments, the attitude of politicians is positive towards protests, law enforcement also feel that they are important to protect them. One of the examples, I'm not saying that it's a perfect example, that we discussed in Mexico, for example. One of the experience that law enforcement share with me, the police and other people, they say that since the new government came in power, there was a clear instruction from the president that the attitude of law enforcement should be to protect people to protest, not to repress them. And because of that, the government also put resources in place to be able to train women police. And whenever there is a protest on March, 8th March, or most of those police that will be policing this will be women. And for me, I'm not saying, yes, the implementation is different thing, but at least the positive attitude toward the protest is important, ensuring that we end stigmatization, which is really one of the reasons why some of the repression, we are seeing some of the repression around the world. And the second thing that was also, and this was also particular in COVID, is the misuse of emergency laws. Many countries declaring emergency for any type of protest that happen around the country, and we saw that. And I feel really, I have so many countries, but I don't know how I can pronounce. But I prefer to keep. But we saw that people going on the streets to protest because of increase of oil. why state can declare emergency in this context, than listen to people, than discussing with people, than making sure what is the problem. So declaration of the state emergency, what many of the people told me is the inability of the government really to ensure constructive dialogue with protesters. The declaration of the state of emergency already showed the protest that government is ready to use force. So it's important to avoid the emergency laws that for any single thing, for protests happening around the community, for people complaining for gender violence, state of emergency. State of emergency is abuse, and we need to end that. And we need also to ensure also that states understand the need to change this attitude. Another one is also this tendency of militarization we are seeing currently. Militarization of management of assembly, militarization of police forces, militarization of public life. And we saw that in many cases, states will argue that, that the protesters are terrorists, or that terrorists are among the protesters, and then use the military to police. And even some states will, some leaders will also authorize shoot to kill. And we saw that recently. We saw that recently because it's so easy. And I think this is why I always call the international community that we need really to rethink about what we define as a terrorism. Because terrorism becomes a justification for states to militarize the protest. Terrorism is becoming a justification of many states, authoritarian states also, to repress protests under this label of terrorism. And many raise this concern and ask me also to make sure that this comes clearly on the report, and ask states to really rethink about that. And then another aspect which also come clearly is the use of security forces, or the use of unlawful force, including lethal force against peaceful protesters. We saw in many cases that even we are talking about the need for law enforcement to be trained. We are seeing little by little that even in most of the law enforcement that I met that come to share experience, I was really shocked to see that there is no, most of them, there is no protocol on the use of force. And I asked many of them, can you send me the protocol that you have in use of? Do you have your protocol that have this graduation of use of force? There is none. And I was also happy that during this experience, many countries that came with protocol of use of force, they now are ready to share it with others, because other law enforcement, from the information I received, are now getting together to see how do we share that. And the lack of this protocol, clear protocol sometimes, it also opened the space, and it's also opened the way for the law enforcement to use the force as they understand that. And it is important, in particular during COVID-19, this is what we saw, that the use of force, than managing the COVID-19 as human rights issue, as a challenge that human rights is facing. We know that the management of the COVID-19 was more based on the military perspective, not than human rights perspective. And this is also one of the issues that came out clearly, which I want also to really bring here. And another aspect also that is important to raise here is also the repression and also the gender violence during the peaceful protests. We saw that in many, and we received many concerns from, and this, we know that most of the protests happening around the world, you look at from the Sudan, Yemen, Myanmar, women are leading these protests. And one of the weapons we are seeing now is is rape, to really discourage women for participation to these people. And some law enforcement recognize that and say that there is a need really to reinforce within the police the gender perspective on looking at policing of protests. It is important also if we want to continue to give the space for women also. And then we know one of the aspects, and I will end there, is also the whole issue about online and offline protests, because we saw in many countries that because of the increase on use of online tools to enhance the protest, to enhance the mobilization, many governments also are putting in place equipment like a CCTV camera. They are also putting all the surveillance material to also sometimes arrest protests even before the protest starts. And I think most of you are here will also give us some perspective of your country. But one thing that I want to add before I end is really, while we are seeing now that the world is facing a lot of crises, we are moving from climate crisis, conflict, inequality. We know that people will express their view on the streets. It's now time for the Human Rights Council. It's a time now really to ensure that there is commitment to protect this fundamental right. This is why I also emphasize that we need the international community to impose embargo on arms that in countries where there is a repression of peaceful protests. We need international community need also to ensure international accountability where national courts are not able to take up some of the cases of repression. And we need the international community also to continue also to support strong resolution that will be put forward this year at the Human Rights Council, and also the renewal of the mandate in order to really engage again their commitments for this fundamental freedom. Thank you very much, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Clément, for framing the discussion, for summarizing your report, and for highlighting so many aspects that put at risk the enjoyment of the freedom of protest and peaceful protests around the world. I have a very good panel, and I am afraid I will have to be very strict with time because we have 5 speakers, and I know that each of you have a tremendous amount of knowledge and expertise to share with us. So in order so that we can have also an interaction, I will try to keep it very, very on time. And I would like then to start, we have 5 strong civil society voices. I will start with the first speaker, that is Sofía Forero. She is from the Justicia Colombia, and she will be speaking to us about the challenges to protest in the context of economic crisis, COVID-19 and police violence. So please, Sofía, muchas gracias.
Good afternoon to all. I'm grateful for the invitation made by the Special Rapporteur, Mr. Clément Voule, to participate in this event and to consider Colombia's experience on peaceful protest in crisis contexts as relevant. My name is Sofía Forero, and I would like to clarify that I do not come from a social movement or a grassroots organization, but from the Justicia, which is a non-governmental organization based in Bogotá, Colombia, that defends the right to protest through research, litigation, and advocacy. In the report, the Special Rapporteur identified the following key global trends that seriously impede the protection of human rights in the context of peaceful protests in crisis, like stigmatization, abuse of emergency powers, militarization, and use of unlawful force to stifle peaceful protests, compounded by endemic impunity for serious violations. All of these factors have taken place in the Colombian context. Most have been occurring for decades. However, they have been more evident from 2019 to date, a period in which Colombia has had large mobilization days. The health crisis caused by COVID-19 affected Colombia, unleashing a social and economic crisis due to the strict confinement measures. This generated an increase in poverty, hunger, inequality, and different kinds of discrimination, socioeconomic, gender, and racial. These elements are associated with historical and structural inequalities that have affected specific populations, such as women, youth, indigenous people, and people of African descent in Colombia. Although it is long-standing factors, it was aggravated during the health crisis. Yesterday, there was presidential elections in my country, and something historical happened because a leftist candidate was elected. His government plan has strong components of guarantee of rights and social justice. It responds to the demands and social claims for education, health, equality, the right to work, and other things like environmental protection and implementation of the peace agreement. So this new government will have to face many challenges to fulfill the program because there is an organized and mobilized civil society that will demand it. In this context, many of the recommendations of the report are relevant to Colombia. Among them, I highlight the following. Avoid stigmatization of those who call for and participate in demonstrations. Due to historical circumstances related to the armed conflict, social protest in Colombia has been understood as a matter of security and public order, instead of a right whose exercise should be promoted and protected. Protest has been associated with terrorism and threats to democracy. However, the final agreement for the termination of the armed conflict, which was signed in 2016, considered protest as a fundamental element for participation, which enriches political inclusions. But many authorities continue to stigmatize and associate those who participate in protest with illegal armed groups. The other important thing is facilitating dialogue to resolve the structural causes of the crisis. In Colombia, social grievances are related to inequality, discrimination, and lack of guaranteed rights. In addition to dialogue, the commitment to comply with agreements is essential. One of the most common reasons that encourage social protests in Colombia is the lack of compliance with agreements that were reached in previous demonstrations that were resolved through dialogue. Also, generally in Colombia, repression of peaceful protest is differential and affects more to historically discriminated groups, so it is necessary to guarantee the right on equal conditions. Another thing is issue protocols on the facilitation of peaceful protest for law enforcement. About that, Colombia requires a law that adequately regulates the guarantees for exercising the right to peaceful protest. But in addition to establishing these protocols, it is also necessary to ensure their enforcement. To focus on compliance through incentives and effective sanctions in case of not compliance. Also, it's important the thing about strictly avoid involving the military in policing protest, because in response to the last national strike, the last year, a presidential decree was issued authorizing military assistance in protest, and it is still in force. Related with that, in Colombia, we need a police reform with citizen participation for demilitarize the police and give it a more community-based and rights-based approach. The report also speaks about ending impunity and ensuring accountability. There must be justice and reparations for victims in cases of human rights violations that occur in the context of protest. Identifying and punishing those responsible can help to avoid repetition. So it is necessary to defend judicial independence and the importance of complying with core rulings. And finally, it is important to protect the life and integrity of social leaders who defend human rights in their territories. Guarantee that they can exercise their work, their leadership, their right to defend rights without the risk of being murdered, threatened, or injured as a result. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much, Sofia Forero, for your presentation. And to be very mindful of time, I will now like to give the floor to Dr. Sara Abdelgalil, who is a representative of Sudanese Doctors for Human Rights. And she's going to be talking to us about the importance of protests for peaceful transitions. Please, Doctor.
Thank you, Your Excellency, and I would like to congratulate the Special Rapporteur on this report, which is very relevant to Sudan, sadly, with the current situation and what's been happening. So in March 2019, I presented to the Human Rights Council here in Geneva with the President of the Sudan Doctors Union about the peaceful protest as one of the tools of the peaceful movement in Sudan. The slogan was freedom, peace, and justice, and the legitimate call was a democratic civic state. We Sudanese were very proud of this peaceful movement that managed to force the dictator Omar al-Bashir to step down. Who organized the peaceful protest? The grassroots, including neighborhood committees, the resistant committees, the unionists, ordinary people, different ages, and there is usually a theme every week, usually on Thursday, 1 p.m. Khartoum time. People will participate about women, about health, about education, about social justice, and there will be a hashtag on Twitter. Building barricades, painting graffiti, singing, and playing violin near the barricade. Sometimes it was centralized, sometimes it was non-centralized. Then we had a short period of transitional period. And during that, the peaceful protests continue, this time as like a regulator monitoring what's been happening during the transitional period. The violence against the protests decreased, but still it was there. A huge U-turn took place on the 25th of October last year, an unconstitutional change of power in Sudan. This ended by suspending the membership of Sudan by the African Union. And on the same day, millions of Sudanese took to the street in a peaceful protest, rejecting the unconstitutional change of power, asking of the return of a democratic transition in a nationwide movement. But what happened? And I'll just mention some figures. They may be very distressing. More than 100 were killed, and it was mainly shoot to kill, face, head, neck, and chest injuries, more than 4,000 injured. Some of them are irreversible damage, paralysis, loss of vision, loss of hearing, amputation, detention and ongoing arrest, threats to those who have been protesting, fake allegation, children detained with adults, using international prohibited weapons like the expansion cartridge, where you have the bucket, they expand, they cause serious vascular injuries, and sadly, we lose the protest. Even tear gas was used excessively or lethally, which caused skull fracture, suffocation, and burn. And extending even to residential area, we have a 14-year-old Razan who was killed while she was watching the peaceful protest accidentally from the use of the way of using the weapon. So I'm going to mention two events. The 17th of November, 2021, in Bahri, Khartoum North. This is all documented, verified incidents where the security forces surrounded the open area where the peaceful protests were there, blocking their access to health services, to the hospitals, surrounding the hospitals, invading the hospital, arresting injured people who were protesting. During that event, a young lady was shot to the left jaw and she was killed. Her name was Sitta Nifur Bakar. By losing one life, we lost 4 lives. She was an artist, she was a nurse, She was a women's activist, and she was, a defender for democracy. She was walking peacefully back home after she attended the injured. Again, on the 19th of December, 2021, peaceful protest reached the residential palace. Documented 13 were gang raped by security forces. Sexual violence as a use of weapon continue. So it is really sad to see that it is happening. So in June this year, we have 30 seats empty during the A-level exams. These are missing students who were killed because of the peaceful protests. I would like to say that peaceful protest is one of the tools. But again, after the 25th of October, there is a lot of violation against journalists, cut off the internet for weeks and weeks. This is usually coincide with a significant human rights violation. Arresting musicians like Swat al-Medina, canceling events, tear gassing events, removing graffiti and paintings, as well as cyber bullying, cyber attacks, and fake accounts on the internet. So I would like to end my talk by saying the peaceful protest in Sudan was successful in removing a dictator that stayed for 30 years with crimes against humanity. It was not the only tool, it was one of the tools of solution. However, there is a big gap between what is the international law to protect peaceful protesters and what is the local law and how it is implemented and who is leading on that. So I think we need to focus more on what's been happening and to try and finalize a resolution that can protect peaceful protesters. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abdel Khalil, for your presentation and for your call also for the action of the Human Rights Council on the resolution that we are discussing during this session. I will now give the floor to Konstantin Chernau, who is an activist from CSO, New Region, from Belarus. Please, Konstantin, you have the floor.
Thank you for inviting me to speak here for a time. My name is Konstantin and I'm LGBTQ+ activist from Belarus. Article 35 of the Constitution of my country guarantees freedom of peaceful assembly, demonstration, and picketing. But despite this, only I was detained twice and tortured for going to peaceful protest. The last time was in August 2020, when I was outed and tortured because of my sexual orientation and activism. I was forced to leave the country and became a political refugee. Since the establishment of independent Belarus and the establishment of the Lukashenko regime, the situation with freedom of assembly has been bad. But often it's concerned a small group of people, political activists, their supporters, and small group of protesters. But in August 2020, everything changed, as the suppression of the will, violence, tortures touch almost every Belarusian. More than 60,000 people have passed through prisons and temporary detention centers in Belarus. As of June, 1,227 people are recognized as political prisoners in Belarus. Most of these people were leaders or participants of the protest. According to the Office of Democratic Forces, 8 people were killed during the protest. Unfortunately, no one has been held accountable for this, and the details of this killing are carefully hidden by the regime. The main challenge for civil society now is that participants in protest against electoral funds still pursued by regime, from photos on Instagram, from comments on social networks. Even we consider participation in illegal mass event as an administrative crime, which is prescribed by Belarusian law, then all the statute of limitation for it has passed. Therefore, now the protesters are being prosecuted under fabricated criminal articles, which was mentioned in the report. In recent weeks, the human rights crisis in Belarus has spilled over into trade unions. In April, leaders of the trade unions movement were arrested and have been behind bars since then. Chairman of Belarusian Congress of Democratic Trade Unions, Alexander Yarashuk, his deputy, Sergei Andrusevich, informal leader of Belarusian Trade Union of Workers of Radio and Electronic Industry, Gennady Pedinich, and as well as several other staff members of independent unions. The charges against them are unclear, and advocates are banned from disclosing any information or details regarding these cases. I also want to mention the absolutely inhuman practice of recording videos with detainers where they repent and call their participation in protest a mistake. And we all understand how and in what ways these videos are recorded. There are several cases where people were forced to disclose information about their sexual orientation in this video, which is especially dangerous for LGBT people in Belarus. Also, LGBT people were publicly outed in prisons, which made their stay unbearably. They were subject to additional psychological and physical tortures by the security forces. Trans people were not given the medicines they needed to prisons and detention centers. I want to note the special role of women in the protest in Belarus. They were at the forefront. It was my grassroots activist feminist friend who organized peaceful actions. And also a unique feature of Belarusian protest was the involvement of completely different groups. In addition to individual women's action, there were action of pensioners, people with disabilities, students, doctors, queer people, and others. This shows that absolutely the entire society has consolidated and expressed terrible disagreement with what is happening. Also surprising that all protest action were organized at the grassroots level, in neighborhood and chats in Telegram, in social networks, since political leaders would have been immediately detained for calling for action. And this contributes to the incredibly rallying of Belarusians who did not have this feature before. And I think now it's our great victory is that although in such a terrible way, we have formed as a strong nation. All recommendations to my state to improve the situation with freedom of assembly have already been given by my human rights activists. The most important things are to release political prisoners, bring the legal framework on freedom of assembly in line with international standards, punish people responsible for violence and tortures of protesters, stop the criminalization of peaceful assemblies, and others. But unfortunately, right now, I don't have much hope for the future of my country. Belarus is politically and economically occupied by the Putin regime. The latest protests against the Russian war in Ukraine were marked by hundreds of detentions, and people still have to leave the country in search of safety. Therefore, I ask you to document, preserve, and spread information about the situation in Belarus. I ask you not to forget about Belarus, support the Belarus civil society and Belarus people. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your work, Konstantin. I will now like to give the floor to our next speaker, who is Mr. Simon Chen, and as the founder of Aid and Power, Hong Kongers in Britain, HKB. And he will be talking to us about the protest in the context of the COVID-19 and the impact of national security measures in the protest. Please.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you, Special Rapporteur, for the very excellent report, which actually, when I read through it, is echoing with, the human rights abuse in many areas, especially in my hometown. So I want to be very clear that I'm not here to stand against any specific country. And I want to remind that the country should be composed by human beings. So I here just purely out of my love to my people and to my society. So because that's our people for many decades, that Hong Kongers have been fighting for the full democracy, but the day is still yet to come. I think it's very unimaginable that how quickly such human rights tragedy would affect even me one day. When I was just an ordinary participant in a peaceful protest in 2019 for democracy, I was detained, stigmatized, tortured, forced to confess, and even now still being stigmatized by Chinese state media. Then I have no choice but have to break away from my hometown and being an exiled political fugitive. And since then, I knew that the freedom of Hong Kong that the authorities previously had promised to the people is no more. At least that have been very questioned by many other people, especially since the implementation of the Hong Kong state national security law. We have seen that it's all very ill-defined as a blanket ban and trump up charges to criminalize all dissenting thoughts and speeches, such as secession, subversion, terrorism, including with foreign power, that we're not feeling unfamiliar when many dissidents, human rights lawyers, religious practitioners in mainland China that have been also being detained for this kind of reasons, which that many Hong Kong people would fear about that. So I think that's the main point is under such non-democratic constitution that people have no trust in any excuse of national security. How could we trust that they could respect the human rights? The people doubt if that measure of human rights abuse protection would be enough to stop such power abuse. And even now, if my statement through the UN mechanism, which is supposedly fully legitimate and legal, could be deemed by the Chinese authority as colluding with foreign power. So I will face this trauma charges as a reprisal. It is not just a guess, but a reality already that I'm now wanted by the National Security Department of the Hong Kong Police Force, just because I stand with the principle for human rights for my own people, rather than serving an interest of those few elites in power in my hometown. After cleansing all dissent of all walks of lives, pushing pro-democracy activists in jail, or such as many of my compatriots now in exile, disqualifying opposition politicians from public offices, arresting and harassing the journalists, shutting down all the media which is independent from the government, and trying to do so-called patriotic education to serve the regime to the younger generations of Hong Kong, removing the jury from national security lawsuits, politically appointing lots of judges over national security cases. Then they would only grant bail to those defenders of national security cases, but actually, provided that the judges actually believe those defendants won't be with potential to continue to endanger so-called national security, with harsh conditions of not being able to make any public comment on politics and receive media interview. Promoting and anointed a former security chief who are notorious with the suppressive tactics over peaceful protests to be the next political leader of Hong Kong, that he will become the chief executive of Hong Kong since July this year. Dismantling all rights groups in civil society and replaced by the government-controlled so-called civic groups. The promises of freedom based on specific system in Hong Kong had all gone. And I would say in Hong Kong is undeniably becoming a police state. Hong Kong once was also proud of being only the city under the CCP sovereignty, could be free to organize events to commemorate the 4th June massacre. The protest for basic human rights of Chinese people end up with bloody crackdown after the authority turned soldiers and tanks to their own people. Some acts and sculpture memorizing those social injustice was once the landmark at many universities in Hong Kong. The government fear about it, so the schools suffer pressure and forced to remove it. And due to the COVID-19, this would be a perfect excuse as a restriction for the sake of the public health. It lends convenient reason to the government of Hong Kong to ban all public gatherings for candlelit vigil on 4th June in Hong Kong since 2020. So now even the public gathering for memorizing our sacrifice of the people for democracy, for China, have been now all gone. So I do think that we need to be very, very pluck up our courage. And I really appreciate that Special Rapporteur's pluck up his own courage to address the elephants in the room. It would be a very courageous report that we could start to restore the public confidence to the UN mechanism, which we do believe that we need to rebuild the checks and balance internationally. And that's why following the exodus and massive population fleeing from our own country. So that's why not only in the UK, but around the world, that we set up lots of self-help groups as a grassroots civil society to receive more people for them to seek haven. And definitely through the UN, we do wish that the government would know that they should be constrained their own power when they execute the new imposed national security law. Especially, I think the precondition is that they need to honor the signed British Joint Declaration, which has been registered in the United Nations, which that they should give back the people's rights to vote, give back the democracy of the people. That's the precondition that the people will trust any government behavior to safeguard national security. That national security should be respectful to the human rights, and that's a precondition. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cheng. Now I have the last speaker, who is Madam Suham Elias Sara, from Human Rights and Minorities Rights. She's a human rights and minorities rights activist from Iraq. Please, you have the first. She's joining us online.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
And clear.
Is my voice clear?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Special Rapporteur, distinguished participants. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to participate in this event, to share opinion from civil society in Iraq on the promotion and protection of human rights in the context of peaceful protests. In a rich country like Iraq, there are still many Iraqi families living below the poverty line, lacking sufficient public services, suffering from unemployment and corruption within governmental institutions. Thus, several peaceful protests have occurred in Iraq since 2011, with the longest and the most effective one beginning in October 2019, when demonstrators took to the streets of Baghdad and other cities of demanding basic rights and chanting in Arabic language, Silmiya, which means peaceful. They followed later by calling for the resignation of the prime minister after the situation escalated, resulting in early elections. Unfortunately, the government responded with severe repression against protection by using live bullets and tear gas fires at close range, which led to 100 deaths and thousands injuries among the protesters. Protesters captured these incidents on their mobile cameras. When they began to circulate, the government responded by shutting off the internet and social media. The violence also targeted young women who supported the October demonstrations. Their images were distorted in the media dangerously, damaging their reputations, putting pressure on their families, and frightening other women from participating in the demonstrations. Abductions and disappearance among activists, journalists, and representatives of the civil society organizations who supported the protests continue till today. Unfortunately, the Iraqi government has failed to identify or hold responsible and prosecute those who committed these acts against the protesters. Today, many activists and their families have had to leave Iraq due to the threats and intimidations. Small-scale demonstrations continue primarily about the economic situation. Activists and their families feel unable to openly criticize the government, political figures, which limits true participation in national dialogue. In the Kurdistan region of Iraq, we also feel that freedom of expression is limited. In 2020 and 2021, demonstrations were also repressed. Activists and journalists were arrested, detained, and beaten for participating in the demonstrations or criticizing the authority of the Kurdistan regional government. In some cases, journalists say they were threatened and had their equipment and photos seized. Both international and national law, ICCPR, UNDHR, and many other conventions guarantee the rights to freedom of expression and the rights to freedom of peaceful assembly and association. The Iraqi government must keep these laws and covenant in consideration, as Iraq had ratified and signed them with the international community. Further, these rights are in the Iraqi constitutions, which must be upheld. Peaceful protests and an environment where people feel free to express their views and opinions contribute to a healthy and inclusive dialogue. I would like also to refer to the report of the Special Rapporteur in June 2022, and which consists of valuable recommendations that many of these recommendations are relevant and important to the Iraqi situation to protect the human rights in the context of peaceful protests. Inclusive government that allows diverse opinion to be expressed is the key which can bring justice across the country. This will ensure that people are treated equally and have a civil state that respects rights of every single Iraqis, including minorities. The Iraqi government must uphold the law and end impunity to show its sincerity before Iraqi people and the international community. It is imperative to investigate the Iraqi protesters and activist cases that lost their lives while demanding for their basic rights peacefully. Thank you very much for your attention. And thanks for my voice that has helped me to present this while I'm suffering of COVID-19. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation and for being with us despite being a little bit sick. I want to thank all the panelists for all your presentations, for your testimonies, and for the reactions that you had to the relevance of the report and the important highlights that the report brings and how they really have an impact on the lives of protesters around the world. I would like now to see if we have anyone in the room or in the online platforms wishing to make questions to our panelists or comments to what has been discussed. And we will have, I understand we still have some time, and I thank all the panelists for adjusting to time. Sometimes it's very cruel to be the one limiting time, but I wanted to make sure that there were opportunities for interaction or for further comments and questions, either here in the room or in the chat. And I don't know, Jasmine, if we have any question. No. Yes, please. We have one here in the room.
Yes, hello, Michael Kamada from the Gulf Center for Human Rights. Mr. Voule, you mentioned that in speaking with some states, they consider demonstrations to be threats to national security. And what we've seen is increasing use of laws, especially cyber laws, in the Gulf region and elsewhere to criminalize and criminalize freedom of speech, criminalize freedom of association, and sometimes even designate it as terrorism. I was wondering if you could talk about some of the arguments you've heard that, or maybe discuss some of the arguments that have been used so that we understand where they're coming from, because this is a total violation of their commitments under more treaties than most of us care to name.
Yeah, thank you very much, Michael. And I hope I'm not the only one that heard this kind of argument. Even tomorrow, yesterday when interactive dialogue, many states also agreed that. And I think one of them, this argument also came from this tendency of many governments, in particular authoritarian governments, that civil protesters should respect the law in a way that they should abide by the process that is in place to request peace, to request to protest, and also to respect some regulation that are in place. In most cases, not that the protests refuse to do that, but the problem here is that we have in many countries, I highlight in some of my reports, like in Zimbabwe, in Iraq and many countries that I also had in my communication also. I can say that this is public and those countries know that this is an issue that I with them, that the process of authorization of demonstration become very lengthy in a way that if you don't have a lawyer, you will not be able to fulfill this obligation. You need, in some countries, even I was told that the protesters need also to ensure that they have enough people to guarantee the protest with this jacket that can identify them before they are authorized to protest. In other countries, they need also to show that this protest will not lead to any violence. So we need that there is a presumption already that there will be violence in the protest. So in most of the cases, because people are not able to fulfill this commitment, or sometimes people go to protest, and then they are qualified to be a terrorist, to attempt to the national security. And sometimes those protests will be portrayed because the organizer will be labeled as people that have objective to undermine the national security. And I think for me, this is a rhetoric that we are seeing little by little from the many authoritarian regime. And I think it really aims to really undermine the fundamental, the foundation of these rights, meaning that seeing these rights as human right that is protected by the covenants. States want now, most of the states that I'm referring to now, they want now to see these rights as the right that is exercised within the limitation of national law that they have in place, which are not in that do not comply with the national with the international covenant civil and political rights. And this is the reference that they used to make and say that protesters, they are against national law, they are terrorists because they are not able to fulfill this kind of laws. And also we saw, and I think you mentioned also that little by little there is this increase of laws, legislation also to limit, to narrow even the space to protest. The protest is becoming now today difficult, and people even are not able, in most of the cases in the Gulf country, when I met with them, they say we don't no longer have space to protest. And we don't even have space online to protest because online space also is occupied by governments. This is why we also, in a report that I presented last year, I call on the government to stop internet shutdown as a way to cancel this protest. And also we, together with my colleague, we also emphasize that it's important for this council and then for the international community to impose a such moratorium on the sale and use of spy equipments. Pegasus, we know how this was harmful for many. We know this about the recent report, but before even that, we know how many Gulf civil society face because they're spy, and we know also how many companies also help some of these countries. So I think today we have this kind of tools and legal framework that restrict more protests than enable protests.
Thank you very much, Special Rapporteur. I don't know if anyone else would like to make a comment or a question or a reaction to what the panelists have shared with us. Yes, Jasmine.
Yes, we have an online question. So it's a general one asking Clément if he will formally sharing the report with the member states and emphasize the need for states to adhere to the recommendations, with an added comment, if it would be good to include some guidelines to the protesters too, to ensure that we remain within the definition of peaceful protesters.
Well, the report is already shared by states yesterday, and I hope, and I also invite many states also to some that already read the summary to really read the report itself, because I know that most of the question was based on the summary, and even some states accuse me to not be impartial because they think that I only highlights or take example from one region, meaning that some of them did not read the report. But it's the time now to read really for them to go in depth and see the report. The report, if you look at it, the main purpose is really to bring this new narrative of what means really peaceful protest and why it's important for government to protect that. And it's important for state to go. Many law enforcement really told me that it will be helpful for them if authorities understand and support protests. And they know that by doing so, it will decrease violence. It will decrease the number of repression we are seeing around the world. And I think we share it, and I will continue some discussion. And I mentioned this during my interactive dialogue. Some government that still have concern with me, I will be discussing with them. Some already after this presentation already asked me to meet with me, and some also to meet with their law enforcement, which we are open to do. Some already give me invitation to come to their country, either through academic visit to discuss some of the recommendation and how they can amend their legal framework to be in line with the international, to enable the protection of these fundamental freedoms. And also we have also the guideline, and this comes from the law enforcement during our meeting, that they want to see how we can translate this report to the practical tools that the law enforcement can be able to use. And they are ready, many of them are ready also to support the process and to provide their own perspective and see also that how they can share experience among themselves. And we think our main objective here is really to reach the level where protest is seen as rights that should be exercised, is seen as avenue of participation, not is seen as a threat or a kind of right that which is the weapon in a disposal of opposition. That's what I'm mentioning this because I know that this was most of the things that I received when I remember when I visit one country, and now I was talking about visiting the communities that live around mining and see how they are able to mobilize. One of the ministers told me, no, your mandate is about the politician. Why do you want to meet communities? So meaning that this is a kind of understanding that these rights is only exercised by political party, and I think this is completely wrong. If we don't look these rights as the right that empower community, the participation, and also that these rights that should be part of the governance of the country, then we miss really the substance of these rights that the covenant, the Article 21 of the covenants protects.
Thank you very much, Special Rapporteur. I don't see, yes, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Madam Ambassador. I'm Ludwig from the Permanent Mission of the Czech Republic. Thank you so much, Costa Rica and Switzerland and all the other co-sponsors for organizing this event. I have a question to you all panelists. And firstly, thank you very much for sharing your experience in such a calm way. It was in stark contrast with what you were actually saying. And personally, for me, it made it even more impactful. I have a question for you. Is it possible to share with us anything on your experience with our work here in Geneva? We have the excellent work of Mr. Special Rapporteur. We have the resolution on peaceful protest, good work of treaty bodies. Are you able to use this in your daily activities? And would you have any advice for us, for states in this regard, how to bring our work here in Geneva closer to your actual work on the ground? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And that is a very good question on the impact of the work of Geneva in the field and in your activities. And I would like then to give you each 1 minute for a quick reply to that. So we can start with Sofia. Esa es la pregunta. No? You don't want to react to how can you use the thing? Okay, so anyone wants to start? Can I start the other way and then give time to get to the other side?
If I got your question right, you're asking about how can we take this report into action on the ground? And for me, when I'm talking from a Sudan context, I have to say the current situation is very difficult because we have seen a big change. We had the revolution, transitional period, and then we have an unconstitutional change of power military coup. In between, there is a huge difference. So the leadership, the presence of a democratic state that will respect international law, will review the local law and try to implement it and train the policing and make reforms will help. But if you don't have that leadership and you don't have that commitment, I don't think there will be any implementation. However, the report is well written and it is very clear.
Thank you very much. Any impact of the Special Rapporteur report of the other mechanisms that are based in Geneva and issuing human rights recommendations to the states, Mr. Chen?
Yeah, thanks for your question. I think that's for the mechanism here. For example, Hong Kong ratified ICCPR, which is supposed would be not only the international law, but supposed it need to be regarded as domestic law. That would be supposed to be law binding. And we also can see China, at least that they want to act like civilized country internationally. So I think the UN spent a lot of influence and influence over it. We saw it. And it's not surprised that in Hong Kong, many civil society groups have been replaced by the government influenced and controlled groups over there. So this kind of things, I think that we should, for example, fully report and we voice out that we could give them some pressure, that they need to be a bit step back to see they have a limit of power. They cannot be even directly control United Nations here. And they need to step back and say, you know, in some way, for example, the chief executive now, they say, we're willing to, you know, to see it possible in the future, we honor back the Joy Declaration that will give back the people the full kind of democracy. And I think, how can we rebuild some dialogue with them? Although more and more people have been fed up with this, I mean, dialogue and something. But for the UN, we'll see how could we exhaust the channels that we can find the intermediary to see the common ground that we could have a future dialogue with them, with some exile community in the future.
Thank you very much. Before Konstantin, Suham, do you want to react to the question?
Hello, yes. Actually, regarding the Iraqi situation, it's very critical for the time being, because imagine that after 8 months of election, we are still waiting for the government to be formed. Until now, we have a transitional government. So the situation is really critical, what's going on in Iraq. But of course, like with the representatives of the Iraq, the Human Rights Council, the permanent representatives, can be some cooperation regarding like sharing these reports or this like recommendation with the Iraqi government, of course. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Konstantin?
It's very hard to speak like about implementing something in Belarus now, because, you know, but maybe like, I think the best way now is to work with civil society, with like now abroad, because they really help now people that in the country now. For example, now all organization will help women like who suffer from domestic violence are liquidated, and only like organization abroad help to collect money or provide some mental support for these women. And I think now like it's only way like to like support this organization and activists who work abroad. And yeah, because it's like very hard now to imagine how it would work like inside Belarus. Like I can't say it now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't know, Sophia, if you want to react or yes, please. Yes. Go ahead.
In the case of Colombia, all this report and all the guidelines and forums are different instruments are very useful, because the Colombian government like to use it or in the regulations and in the laws. So I think that we have a good laws about protest, but the problem or the difficulty is at implementation level. So this kind of documents help to the organizations and the social movement to press for this implementation of the standards. Yes, I think it is the most important thing for them.
Well, thank you very much. And before I give you the floor, Special Rapporteur, again for the closing of the event, and if I may, if you allow me also as a former human rights expert, I think that, I mean, first of all, I want to thank you for your work. I think that the work of the independent voices that bring to the Geneva community and to the international community an objective assessment of the challenges that we are facing when it comes to implementation of human rights is fundamental. That we need to, although we face with challenges when it comes to the implementation of the recommendations, we need to continue being as strong as possible in the work to try to influence policy change and policy development. I do appreciate very much that you highlighted that in your speech. The aim of the reports is to inform law enforcement, to try to talk to the legislative bodies, to try to talk to the institutions in the different countries about how could they be closer to respect and adhere to the international human rights standards when it comes to peaceful protest. I also think that the system itself, it is already, we benefit from listening to these recommendations that we can use again in the UPR, by the treaty bodies, and discussions in the Human Rights Council and beyond. And of course, it helps our international monitoring. I think that it gives tools to civil society and people working on the ground to, at least, even if the situation is challenging, be able to say, internationally, these are the recommendations, and these recommendations are not being followed in different circumstances in different countries. I believe that one of the important issues that you said today, Special Rapporteur, was also about how do we change the narrative? How do we make sure that we perceive the protests not as a threat to the national security, but most of all as a tool to increase and enhance democracy, to support development of our countries, a tool that is, helping to take into account the diversity of the voices of the countries, and that will help us indeed to advance. We have challenges, and you have highlighted lots of them. I think that many we're very familiar with. Some are emergent and more present as the limitations in the online space, spyware, issues with use of the internet, etc. But also these the abuse or the not adequate use of the declaration of the state of emergency, and how a tool that could at some point have a real meaning and the need to be used should be, used only on exceptional basis when there is actually, merits, and not as, a potential way for states to repress lawful, peaceful protests. I think that the discussion here, and I will leave it to you as well as Special Rapporteur, is, we're discussing about how to limit the arbitrary repression or arbitrary limitations to peaceful protests, and how to, with this new narrative, how to combat the rhetoric in your words that is trying to frame peaceful protests as a threat and not as a tool of democracy. There are many things, and I think Dr. Abdelghali, sorry, you said something that for me was also very important in terms of protests are just one part we need to have a state that is based on the rule of law and institutions that will allow us to, make the best use of those protests. If we are protesting, but there's no one to undertake or to get the feedback of that protest, we still are going to face tremendous difficulties to advance. But in any case, I really want to appreciate all of you for coming here, for sharing with us. And of course, the Special Rapporteur, to whom I want to give the final word and the closing event for his work and for bringing a little bit of light and hopefully giving states a way forward so that we can also look critically at what we do when it comes to control, to the use of force, to how do we manage and train people to react to the protest, and actually how do we channel the protest in the way that is going to be useful for the development of our states. So I wanted to thank you for that and let you to close the event because we have 5 more minutes. Yeah. So please, Special Rapporteur.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and a sincere thank also for your continued support to human rights work. And I know how your commitment even when you become ambassador, you're still committed to us and supporting the expert. You yourself been the expert before. For those who don't know in the room, chairing our coordination committee, and you understand the challenge we face as experts when we bring our expertise and our critical view. And thank you for continuing to really support us, but also Switzerland also for really. I know this is a very critical subject in this particular time, but I think it's not easy for any country to stand up, really continue to promote the right that is seen by some country as interference in their national policy or their domestic law. But I think it's important and to really congratulate Switzerland for doing so. And I think we need also to look at all of this as, and I say that, the limitation, the repression of the protests, as part also on really undermine the whole democracy around the world. One of the perspectives which I think is important for the international community to think forward is also what is the part of populism that we are seeing or pushback on many rights we are seeing today. What is the responsibility and cause of that in really this broad of repression that we are seeing? Why I'm saying that? Because you can see that around the world today, most of the protests dealing with those specific rights, abortion, LGBTI, minority, those rights that we gained for many years, today, they are not even accepted as rights. Then it triggers repression. So we need also to think about what kind of, how the cross-regional tendency of leaders, some leaders that I won't name the name here, are also strengthening this movement around the world against the rights, women's rights, LGBT rights, vulnerable groups' rights, how they are. And I think it's important for Council to really think about having this as one of the topics to really discuss about, because we know that this is so fragile, it's fragilizing the international system ability to continue to protect these rights. Today, you can't even talk about this issue at the Council. Today, whenever you put this issue on the table, what you are opposed to is a national security. So it's important. And then I know, as you mentioned, and I fully agree with you, there is no implementation without the will, without really government's will to really implement that. And most of the countries that we have around this table is also more countries that we have really challenges with protests in this country. But however, as I mentioned, during this consultation, I was also really encouraged to see even law enforcement understanding and say that, yes, we should protect that. We have capacity to protect it. It's a matter of understanding. I fully understand the need, the balance between security, imperative of protecting people's security, protecting the number of that, but also ensuring that people enjoy their fundamental freedom. But I'm completely against that. These two cannot work together. They can work together. That's exactly why human rights is there. That's exactly why we have law enforcement. It's to protect our rights. It's not to undermine our rights. And I think during this discussion, I was so impressed to hear them being more open to say, we know, and we would like to learn more about that. We know that this is important. We know that many protests change our own life. Many protests that happen around where they were able to increase our own salary, that our families also will become better. Why we shouldn't represent those people that are claiming better life for all of us? And I think this is an argument that I will continue to use. And also, many leaders after this interactive dialogue came to me. Some ambassador came to me and asked me, yes, we have political statement that we made, but we know that you are right. Let's discuss how we can move forward and that. Which means that there is really this kind of capital of energy that is coming up to understand that while we are really moving towards now with conflict we are seeing around the world, Ukraine, Yemen, Iraq, Syria, around the world, we know that if you look at history, the only possibility that we were able to stop some of this is through the exercise of protest that state and international community understand that we are against around the world. But if this space disappears today, then what else we have to really ensure that many states, international community understand our view against militarization again that we are seeing around the world, nuclear weapon coming back again. We need to protect peaceful protests. If we don't protect them, we undermine our freedom, we undermine our democracy, we undermine our future. Without protest, we will never be able to overcome climate change issue. See how young people protest, mobilize the international community and step that is taken. If tomorrow we are no longer able to protest, then we are no longer able to build this world, to build living together, to also ensure that we have a world that addresses our challenge and underlying problem, which is inequality, which is marginalization. So I want also to reassure Ambassador that my mandate will continue to push. We will continue to open up space to discuss with state, to discuss with law enforcement. But as I mentioned always, my mandate, I should not be neutral because I have to take part of human rights. I'm not neutral. I can be impartial, but I cannot be neutral because I have to take part of human rights. This is why I'm here. So thank you very much. And I really think that this dialogue also is an opportunity for us to continue. And I want to thank also a lot of civil society that co-sponsor this meeting and say also that your co-sponsorship now should be now the force for us to discuss on how we implement this thing, how we help state to implement that. Thank you also, my fellow panelists, for coming here and for your time. I really appreciate. Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you, Sister, for sharing.
Well, thank you very much. And so with this, we end the side event. Thank you.
Thank you.